Everyone has entered and we are now live. So welcome everybody. You're witnessing a miracle. I think that would be the first thing I would say, is if we actually manage to pull this webinar off. My name is Catherine Curl and I'll be moderating the discussion today, and I'm doing so in my capacity as the chair of the London chapter of the Professional Risk Managers International Association. And for those of you who are members, you'll already know that this is a global organization dedicated to the improvement of risk management practice. If you're not a member, we hope you'll consider joining. I'm joined today by a distinguished panel. We have Karina Townley, who's Managing Director of Client Services for PRMIA of Guidant Global, which is an international managed services outsourcing specialist. So she manages a number of large teams across a fairly broad geography, and will have some interesting insights to share with us. We're also joined by Kathy Griffin. Kathy is Chief Risk Officer of Earned, which is an organization that provides free wage day advances to employees. Our third panelist is Sadia Mujib, who is a member of the PRMIA Steerco here in London. She's also the global head of hedge funds, asset managers, prime brokerage, and central clearinghouses in the risk area of NatWest markets. And finally, we're expecting shortly to be joined by Diana Paredes, who's the Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of Suede Labs.
I am here.
Oh, you are? Excellent. As I said, it'll be a miracle if this whole thing works. Anyway, Diane, I'm delighted to see you. And Suede Labs is a software platform that enables financial institutions to understand and meet their regulatory requirements. So welcome all. Unfortunately, we were Paul Acer Archer, who's the head of compliance at O2 Telefonica, was unable to attend today, but sends his apologies, and we hope we can hear from him at a later event. Before we dig into our questions, I just wanted to mention a couple of things. One is we're expecting to put together a short one-page white paper summary of the comments you'll hear today, so watch out for that. We'll ask you to fill out a survey telling us what you thought of today's event and what suggestions you might have for upcoming events. Finally, just a bit about how we expect today to work. We have an hour, and we expect to spend the first 45 minutes or so in a discussion with our panelists, at which time we'll break for questions from you. And I'd ask you to use the Q&A function on the toolbar at the bottom of your screen if you want to pose a question. At the same time, we'll be asking you a few questions, the ones that we asked the panelists, and so you get a chance to weigh in and let us know how you would answer the questions, or some of the questions that I'll be asking them. Lucy, what have I forgotten? Anything? I'll take that as a no. Okay. All right, before we dive into questions, I thought it would be useful just to get a bit of an idea as to the nature of the teams that you all are managing. We're facing special challenges now in terms of management generally, but I know a number of you have teams that are diverse along various axes, and I can imagine that given the circumstances, that's making things more challenging than usual. So I might just ask you each in turn to say a few words about the teams that you manage, and maybe start with you, Karina.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Kathy. So as you said, I'm Karina Townley. I'm the Managing Director for Client Services for Guidant Global. And as a business, I manage and are responsible for delivery to a number of different clients, over 40 across the UK. and across Europe in terms of outsourced recruitment solutions. So what we see within our geographical location is quite fast spread. We aren't office based in terms of, we have 3 main core offices in the UK for our delivery, but then we're also based across multiple client sites as well. And in addition to that, our age demographic is fairly split as well in terms of the generations that we have. So we also have a very active female bias in terms of our gender split. So we're about 70% female, 30% male in terms of our gender split across our business as well. And in response to all of the varying challenges that you've mentioned, which I know we'll go on to talk about, what we have is very balanced, but also across the UK, definitely it creates challenges in that sense when you're faced with kind of the agile times you have. The one thing that also to mention in terms of my role, and it's very pertinent to obviously the content of this session, is that I'm also a member of the Recruitment Industry Disability Initiative, RIDI, which has a purpose which is ultimately to open up the talent pool, break down barriers for enabling disabled talent to progress within the marketplace. So that's quite pertinent in the society we're facing in today. So the diverse portfolios that we manage across our business.
Thank you very much for that, Karina. Kathy.
Yes, hi everyone. So I run the assurance, risk and compliance teams for Earned. We are based, my immediate team is based predominantly in the UK, but in a combination of roles between London and Warrington. But the wider team is also operating in Australia as well, so that presents some challenges with time differences, which I seem to be completely incapable of figuring out despite all of these months.
I'm sure it's either add or subtract 13 hours, isn't it?
Something like that. I've never got it right yet. So my team, again, has quite a heavy gender split in terms of women. So we're predominantly women in the team. But we have quite a diversity of backgrounds. So we have people who are from very different backgrounds, different nationalities, and pertinently in today's crazy world, very different family and social situations. So that's making lockdown particularly interesting for them. And with a key thing, I suppose, probably to note is that a lot of my team has joined during lockdown, which has presented a degree of challenge that they have overcome admirably, actually. But it's certainly, when we move into sort of the wider topic, it's certainly something that's been a real challenge for us.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Sadia.
Sure. So as you said, I run 4 global teams. They are geographically diverse, so in New York, London, Amsterdam, Hong Kong, and in India. Diverse in terms of age range, so we've got graduates from university and others that are on the seasoned end, so who've been working for 30 years, and everyone in between. We don't have this is banking, so we don't have that gender diversity that we would like, so that is something we are certainly working towards. However, I think we do have the age range and the background diversity as well.
Sadia, from the sounds of it, you can stay up 24 hours a day to communicate with your team, essentially.
Sometimes, yes.
It feels like that. Diana.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I guess from my perspective, so I have a team of about 40 people. It's very developer heavy, so we do have a lot of guys, and it's actually been quite hard to find women in that space. On the business side, we have a lot more women, and I think from like diversity perspective, I've been obviously trying to actively hire more chicas to hang out with me as well, because when I started the company, it was literally just me and the boys for the first couple of years. And don't get me wrong, they're really nice, but you always need some companionship, sisterhood effectively. And yeah, I mean, I think that it's been interesting during this period in terms of managing them. I have to say that we have found that managing the devs remotely was pretty easy, because it's very easy to kind of see their output. You can kind of like measure that very quickly in terms of, you know, lines of code they've produced, how many things they're pushing. You can actually see that very transparently. On the business side, it's a lot more difficult because obviously the way we were, you know, we've been operating in the past few years, and myself as a manager, I'm relatively informal. And so that means that, you know, we have processes in place, of course, when it comes to clients, but maybe the way that we operate is a bit more fluid. Because that's just how we like working. And in a situation like this, you need to get some KPIs in place so that you can actually track what people are doing. So I think that it's been quite interesting because it's been kind of like a time to put in place a lot of processes, maybe to track certain things that if you are in the office, you don't really need to track because you can kind of see what people are doing. And a bit like Kathy, you know, we've actually, because we're growing, we've been hiring quite a lot of people during this time, and we continue growing. So, you know, in the past week, we've added another 10 people to the team, right? So that's going to be, you know, 50 people. So in the process of growth in this kind of scenario, it's presented a lot of opportunities because obviously the market has, you know, flow of people who unfortunately
it's a buyer's market.
Yeah, so that's been good. But it's been interesting, you know, to kind of think about the realities of like setting them up. This week, you know, next week we have like 3 people starting remotely. They've never met the team, right? They've never met me. And so I think that it presents its challenges and its opportunities, like I was mentioning, but it's definitely a time to kind of like, you know, rethink, regroup, strategize, put in place certain processes that maybe you didn't think were as necessary when you were in an office kind of environment.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for that. I guess, I mean, the pandemic has affected all of us personally as well as professionally. I'm just wondering, in terms of the nature and amount of work that your team is doing, what changes have you observed? And I might ask Karina to take a stab at this first. How has the epidemic affected the nature and amount of work your team is doing?
I think we all now know how to use Skype, Zoom, and the multiple online conference platforms, which I was one of those that kind of rarely turned my video conference on when those calls came through. So I think as a business, like every business, overnight they had to change their way of working. So every single business, and ours is no exception to that, had to adapt and be very agile in terms of the remote working and needing to enable that. And I think for our business, where we work with very many different clients, that some have seen an impact on recruitment, some have seen, some are still hiring. We have quite a balanced portfolio of clients within different industry sectors. So in some aspects they're still hiring, and some there isn't. But I think at an individual business level, our speed of response has had to remain fast in terms of servicing customers. But I think the biggest challenge probably for myself and my teams is the fact that we're working in circumstances that no one's ever seen before. And I, for one, have found it difficult that in this environment, we don't know the answers to everything. So where the government is rolling out things like job retention scheme, we don't know the answers to all the questions, and yet we want to be able to respond in the same fashion, because we want to still be able to service our customers, our candidates and our people. But having to react when you don't know the answers is been quite difficult, I think, but more difficult because of the fact that the industry we work in is about delivering, and in these uncertain times, the only thing at the moment that seems certain is uncertainty, because there's every day is a learning day, not just on a tech perspective. Everything seems to be coming and changing at such speed that it's being able to remain agile and also remain positive for everyone in these times, because the fact that every individual is impacted in different ways, from their own well-being to their own family circumstances, over and above just work. So the nature and the amount of work remains, but it's different. It's like the new normal, which no one quite knows what that is yet. But how we're doing it is still very much in the essence of, we have to respond, but due to the fact that everyone knows all the answers and it's changing daily, it's sometimes been harder to just act as quickly as we would have done before.
Yeah, yeah, I can certainly understand that. This illustrates the difference between risk and uncertainty. We're definitely operating uncertainty. Anything anyone else wants to add to that? Nature and amount of work your teams are doing, more or less.
Sure. I mean, from my portfolio, as everyone can probably imagine, so hedge funds and funds are directly affected with the volatile market. So our workload has, multiplied by a factor of, sort of 5. In addition to everyone now working remotely without being able to have the data sources out to your fingertips. So you can't go and speak to the traders. You don't have access to Bloomberg. So that has certainly been a challenge, because you're now having to rely on each other and where people can get information. And it's just encouraged a lot more sharing. And I know we're going to talk about communication later on, but this is where Zoom has really come into its own.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Diana, Kathy, anything you'd like to add?
I suppose from the perspective of my team, we are a startup, and we're in a period of what was supposed to be exponential growth. And of course, that has been challenging, bearing in mind the people that we work most closely with at the NHS, who clearly have other priorities, quite rightly, at the moment. But from an output perspective, I've been really proud to see that actually there has been no decrease in output or in quality. I think it's just harder fought. I think people are, I think if anything, the struggle is to stop people working, because there doesn't feel like a natural end to your working day anymore. So one of the things I'm really keen on is checking that my team log off to try and sort of retain some semblance of home life balance.
Excellent. Diana, how about the regulation probably remains a challenge regardless.
You always have to do regulation. I mean, I think for us, it's been really, it's been a lot of work. I would say a lot more work in some ways. We were looking at opening an office before the end of the year in New York, one in Singapore, and we have clients in those locations. And so when before I would literally travel to do like a week block of meetings, I had to do everything from here, right? And so that has meant that, for example, yesterday we were trying to finalize a big contract. I was up until 4 a.m. So that was not fun. And then my baby wakes up at 7. So she doesn't care, right, that I'm up late at night negotiating contracts. But I think that's meant fundamentally, when I speak to other peers, I think it's a lot harder for managers as well. So I think, we're very concerned for our staff. I've been very concerned for their mental health, to be honest, because I do start thinking, you start feeling, the buzz in the calls and that kind of stuff. You try to put a lot more energy into them because you're the manager, right? So you're captain of the ship, so you have to keep the energy up. And some days you don't feel like it, right? And I think that for a lot of people, it's been hard. It's been really hard to be at home, and you can feel it. I can even hear it from some client calls. You can feel that after being at home for 2 months, people are starting to really get a bit depressed, right? So thankfully, we're kind of out of we're starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel. But I do think that if they hadn't started giving some measures of easing the lockdown, you would have seen like a much more serious dip in mental health. So I think for managers, there is a reality that you're just really trying to be considerate. That, as Kathy was mentioning, everyone is almost working all the time, because there's no differentiation between going to work and just being at home anymore. And so you find people that wake up, and developers in particular, right? They will kind of wake up and just go straight to their laptop. They love what they do, so they don't necessarily disconnect. All of those things mean that for me as a manager, I feel very concerned. I put a lot more energy into my interactions with them. And the consequence, I think, for a lot of, CEOs, managers of big teams and teams in general, is that we feel like we're working 4 times the what we usually would be working, right? Because we're trying to keep momentum, and that's a lot of energy when you're trying to do it virtually than when you do it in a meeting, basically.
No, absolutely. I can certainly understand that. As Karina said, we've all learned how to use Zoom more or less. I'm just wondering how you all are communicating with your teams in terms of not only the use of video conferencing, but also What messages are you delivering and how frequently are you delivering them? Kathy, do you want to take a bash at that?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, Karina's right. The Zooming is pretty much relentless for everybody. So in my team, for those that are more established and joined pre-lockdown, we have weekly one-to-ones as a minimum, and then we have a weekly team Zoom as well, where we have everyone together, and they tend to be a mixture of chats about work, but also chats about personal situations. We have, as I mentioned earlier, my team are very diverse in their background and in their living arrangements, so making sure that they are bespoke to what the individual needs is really important. And if they just want to have a moan about their kids driving them crazy, or in my case, their husband's driving them crazy, then that's fine. And we try and get that balance right. We sort of, for the people that have joined during lockdown in the early weeks, that contact is obviously much more frequent, and we make sure that they have sort of daily contact with me, but also with the wider team as well, so they can really start to feel part of something. Being the new person is hard enough anyway, but in these times when you can't build face-to-face relationships with people, that's something we've worked really hard on. In addition to the sort of one-to-ones and the more formal stuff, we also, as a business, have drop-in sessions every day where people can just pop into an open Zoom and just chat. We're really, like I mentioned earlier, we're really trying to encourage people to take breaks. So even if that break is still looking at your laptop, it could be something away from work and just chatting the whole water cooler chats that we used to have in the olden days. So yeah, we're trying. I think we're probably still finding our feet, even though we're a few weeks into it. But I'll very much be led by the individual. And I try. It's difficult because, bearing in mind Zoom or other options are available, is the only way we have of communicating. I think we're all, especially as leaders, finding our days are full of Zooms. So I'm trying to keep space in my diary for people to initiate contact with me as and when they need them, rather than at a predetermined time, which is what they would have face to face.
I might ask you, Sadia, on this. I'm just thinking about having a team spread across the 4 corners of the globe. I hope you don't have an open Zoom
no, we have
channel. I could just imagine. No, but how are you managing to communicate with a team that is so geographically diverse?
So we actually had video calls as BAU, because we wanted to encourage people to meet face to face and have that relationship built. So it's actually been very easy for us, because it's just an extension of that, but just more frequently and now in people's homes. So you can be a bit nosy and have a look at, how they've set their house up when people are giving tours. So it's actually worked out really well, but we were lucky because we were already a global team. We were already joined up, and we were having these virtual calls on telephone and video. Didn't really make much of a difference. It's just during the COVID crisis, just the market volatility has gone so much. It just means you're constantly communicating. If it's via email, by instant messenger, then it's Zoom and a telephone, it does get too much. And so what we're trying to do is have people put time in the calendar saying, I'm off the desk. Off the desk meaning I'm not on my laptop, I'm doing something different. Just so that people know, don't contact them during that time.
That's an interesting idea. Karina, Diana, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think Kathy's point is really valid in terms of the need to be able to speak openly about the real events that are happening as well, because whilst day to day continues, because actually overnight all of a sudden everyone's working remotely, there's no getting away from the fact that if you watch the news, it's devastating in terms of the impact on every individual. And I think the element of bringing in your real self, and that's so important, to bring your whole self to work anyway and be able to speak openly with your managers and with your colleagues, but no more so at a time like this where all of a sudden everyone's either got their pets in the background 24/7, their children, whatever it might be. It's really important to be able to discuss with your teams and communicate with them that actually today's not a great day, and that's something. I'm quite an open person anyway, and that's something that we encourage, but I think it's been really important that people can see that as an opportunity to be able to go, mine's not a great day either, I'm struggled with my daughter's fractions, whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm.
And having that degree of kind of being an empathetic leader is so important. So just understanding that the needs of others you really need to tune into and communicate and pick up on that via a video call, which is sometimes a bit harder because it's very easy to put yourself on mute, it's very easy to not talk, whereas when you're in an office it's easier to read that body language. So I think being able to pick up on that and adapt through communication has really been important. So I think that true kind of leadership needs to come through in that way in terms of understanding your people.
Diana, anything you wanted to add?
I mean, not much to add. I guess to echo what everyone has said. I mean, one thing that we have found to be fun is we've been doing like Friday pub at the end of the world drinks, and we kind of all gather via Zoom actually, which we have found to be the best way to get the whole team in one call. And that's kind of transformed into like pub quizzes, and everyone that wins kind of gets to do the next pub quiz. And so that's been actually really, really fun. And I think that was actually an interesting experiment, because when we started it, we thought the team would kind of like join in because they had to, and they would just log off as fast as they could. But it's been interesting to see that people actually stay, really dialed in for a couple of hours and just talk about random stuff. And I think that's, again, a big signal for me that people are missing this kind of human interaction, right? And so whatever you can provide them that gives them that, let's try to do it, right, as a manager.
So it sounds like what you're doing there, if I understand you correctly, is, I guess, including on the management agenda, creating opportunity for your team members to interact informally, which probably was not on your list of your to-do list previously. No, no. Are there other things that for the others of you that you're doing differently now as a manager from the way you used to do things previously?
I think from our perspective, you'd always have your one-to-ones, and you'd have your regional team meetings. I think the frequency is just increased. And people will just have a call, and rather than have a telephone call where you can't really read the body language and know whether people are listening, it's a video. So it's a much more efficient way of working, in my view. So we've done a lot of that. And similar to what Diana said, we have also started doing the informal, Friday up, 4 o'clock, we're just going to open up a Zoom, whoever wants to drop in, just chat, and it's not work. So we've made it very explicit. You're not allowed to talk about work. It's about something else. And it's quite fun.
Interesting.
De-stress.
Yeah, interesting. Anything else from anyone else in terms of things that you're used to do that you're still doing, or things that you have never tried before that you're doing now?
I think within our business, we've always had, and always, since 2015, we've used a platform called Open Blend, which is a wellbeing platform which really tunes into, rather than the work-life balance, it's a blend of work and life in today's society. And again, because of where we're faced with, no more so when there's so many factors influencing people. So in terms of how we've adapted to that, we actually have really good insight into what's important to an individual through the Open Blend that we utilize. So it's a platform that enables people to tell us what's important to them. So at an individual level, a leader can speak to their individual team members and know what's important, ask how they're feeling, ask how we can help them with their blend of work and life, which is very much merging at the moment. And what we know is that kind of before mid-March this year, we knew that there was kind of 10 blend elements which were very important to people. And after mid-March, we've identified there's been a shift in that. So all of a sudden, there's people have expressed that an element that's important to them is around flexible working, mindset, no great surprise, and that all of a sudden that's something that they want to discuss and be able to be open with their managers. And also their partners have been increased, because all of a sudden you're in your house a lot more. So actually in terms of being different, we've been able to look at our Open Blend platform and understand from that how we need to be different and how we can support. So that has been something that's always been very insightful and has remained. And I think it just goes back to, as a manager, when you're working with your team, being able to respond, pick up on the feelings, pick up on how they're talking, how their language is a real indicator of actually how we need to continue to adapt to it. But certainly from our perspective, giving people that voice has been very important, and that's why the Open Blend technology that we use enables that as well.
It's interesting. I haven't heard of Open Blend previously, but that sounds like a really interesting concept.
Yeah, it's very good.
We've also,
sorry, go ahead, Catherine.
So a couple of other things that we've done is I was cynical at first because that's my default state, but we started doing weekly mindfulness and meditation sessions for people who want to join. We got somebody external into those, and we got a really good take up. And I went to a few of them, and I fell asleep every time, so I guess that means it worked. I'm not sure if that was the aim or not. And then we've also done things like, I'm sure a lot of companies have done this, we've sort of got company subscriptions to apps like Calm. We're really conscious that at the moment we have people, well, myself included, to be frank, where I'm anxious about lockdown not finishing and not being able to go back to normal, but equally I'm anxious about when it does finish and what that means for my life and how I'll manage that transition. So making sure that we take care of people's mental health has been really important to us.
Interesting. Diana, have you had to do anything differently with your core of developers?
Yeah, I mean, it's been interesting that obviously I come from banking as a background, and so trading floor kind of baby, where I'm like, you cannot do things remotely. I'm like, people have to be at the desk. You have this kind of idea of like FaceTime, which obviously when you start working in startup land, you realize it's not how things operate. But I guess that somewhere I was always quite skeptical about this kind of like, so we have obviously remote days as part of the package for our staff, but in general, I always thought, well, we have to kind of be all together in the room to get like absolute productivity. And then seeing the results that we're getting in terms of productivity in many situations actually being up, it kind of opens your eyes to, thinking in a very different way about your workforce. And so for us, that has meant, so now as we go back to normal, we've actually been considering maybe doing, like every Friday, like the whole company being working from home. Because I think that what we realized is that when it comes to work from home, I think there's plenty of studies that say that you could lose a certain amount of productivity. But the thing is that when everyone is working from home, we have found that to be actually really efficient, because it's not like you're not connected. You will have your calls in the morning, everyone speaks to each other. And then if everyone is working from home, then that's not like, you don't feel, if you want, the friction of one person being in the office versus one being at home. And so that has been a really interesting takeaway. So our plan actually, as we go back to normal, I think we're going to kind of like install like a permanent Friday work from home policy. And just see how that works given the results we've had during COVID.
Interesting. I that's a whole other discussion, I think, of whether the office has a future, but very, very interesting.
Yeah.
I'm going to shift tack a little bit here and just to ask you all to, if you could just share with us what you consider to be your single biggest management challenge at the moment. And then we'll have a chance to talk about opportunity. But what's the biggest challenge you face?
I think it's about, oh,
Go
sorry.
ahead, Sadia. Go ahead, Sadia.
Yeah, I was going to say, in terms, for us, it's, you have all these deliverables, they haven't changed. They're all required on a timely basis. And you also know your team has been working, and is stretched for months, and that can't continue. So it's now thinking, okay, for this new normal, whilst we're all going to be at home, is how do we adjust, the time that people spend in front of a computer and allow them to have breaks, because we all say, please take a break. Not everyone does, because the work hasn't finished. So how do we work together as a team, as a global team, is maybe do it in shifts, think about, okay, you know, today I'm going to be online, you know, all day. Tomorrow I'm going to take the afternoon to actually do some work, because ultimately, if you're always on Zoom calls, you don't actually get a chance to actually write anything, and you don't want to do it in the evening. So that's the challenge, is the go forward model. What's going to work for everyone? Noting people's circumstances are different. So as Kathy said, you know, some people have a different setup. You know, some have a family at home, and so there's different obligations on them. Others are by themselves, and therefore we need to be considerate on people's backgrounds. So that's still a challenge. We haven't sort of come to a conclusion as to what's going to work going forward.
Interesting. Other challenges, yes.
Other challenges, I think it's really hard to understand what the new normal is going to look like and to plan for that, right? And so I think that has been for me a big problem, because I think, so for example, you know, we have a relatively young team, just because, you know, of being in tech, I guess, but you know, 3 people have kids, including myself, right? And so the realities of work from home with children is very different than actually when you have, you know, when you're single and ready to mingle. And so I think that if this is a situation that could happen again, right? So trying to, like, as we come out of lockdown, for me, like really trying to think as to whether this is like the new normal versus was just like a one-off freak situation, means that you have to really start thinking more carefully around what do you do if this happens again, right? Because then as you start hiring more people in a certain age group, or if your own staff starts having children, and then we get into the situation every year, you need to really start planning for this kind of things, right? Because I do think that, you know, I have found it incredibly difficult to work with kids at home. I know it's the same for a lot of our clients, not necessarily as much for my staff. But, you know, these kind of considerations, I think, have not really been very well thought out from the government. You know, to expect people to be working whilst raising a family, or if they're taking care of someone, as in what that actually means. You know, it's a full-time job to take care of, you know, a kid or a parent, and that was not really priced into this trade-off of working from home conversation. So how do we plan for that in the future?
Assuming we survive this this challenge today. Biggest management challenge. Anything to add to that, Karina?
I think it's the unknown. I think it's the fact that, touching on what's already been said, really, it's just the fact that we still don't quite know what it's going to look like, and equally, along with that, you're also needing to very much balance every single individual person within your business, personal circumstances, personal feelings around coming back, and how that's going to impact them emotionally, physically, financially, whatever it might be. It's that whole element of unknown that seems to change daily as well, or seems to be, because no one has all the answers at the moment. So I think the biggest challenge is not knowing and planning for what you think might be normal or new normal, but then equally it could change, which is a positive thing in terms of being agile, and every business has been agile in that sense. But I think the unknown it always creates kind of a challenge, because it's just uncertain, and that's hard to manage, but also
Excellent. Kathy, what would you say is your single biggest management challenge at this point?
So I think for me, it comes down to time. So my key priority is to make sure I try and carve out enough time for my team. But equally, as I mentioned earlier, your only communication channels are now so different. So I'm having a lot more calls with the wider company as well. So that's difficult. But really layered into that is taking a bit of time for me to think and reflect and to make decisions. And I feel like on a sort of a day-to-day basis, we're doing a really good job of churning through the work, getting things done, making things happen, which is what you'd expect from a fintech startup. But trying to balance that with the time that you would normally spend thinking about longer-term strategy and goals and objectives. I'm not sure I've got that right yet, but hopefully I won't have too much time to get it right before we go back to normal.
I can only imagine, and just having some downtime to refresh would also be challenging, I would think. Is there a silver lining to this cloud. If you had to say, if you had to state what was the single best thing that's come out of this for you as a manager, what would you say?
I think
What's
it's
the benefit?
People talking about how they're feeling. So I've always wanted to talk about, because of my own background, I've always wanted to talk about mental health and anxiety and imposter syndrome and all of that stuff that's really important to talk about. And I think we're getting better at that. But in this time, I think people are so much more open to it. So we sit as a whole team and just talk about, and if we're having a bad day and someone needs a bit of a cry, normally me, then that's absolutely fine. And I think we've seen that across gender, we've seen it across background, everybody is just much more open to saying, isn't this rubbish, isn't this hard? And if we can keep that going in the future, I think actually we've got a bit of a win.
Excellent. Benefits.
I think another benefit is definitely that all aside from kind of well-being, which is such a priority, I think if you look at it from a day-to-day perspective, it's going to be able to challenge why we can't do things differently. So we've all had to change how we've done things. So I think one benefit will be the fact that we can continue to do that. We can continue to challenge ourselves, with how we're working, continue to challenge our clients in terms of why do we still need to, why can't we do it differently? Because actually the acceptance that how we operate today has changed, should enable us to ask those questions why. So thinking about it from I mentioned RIDI at the beginning, but where from a kind of disabled talent perspective, we're trying to break down barriers to encourage and enable a talent pool which is largely untapped. You can start to challenge people around why do you, those reasonable adjustments that you might have had to make because it's an office-based role, why does it need to be an office-based role? And being able to challenge what was the normal positively, I think can be a benefit, because the answer to some of that might be, I don't know why, but at least it will enable that conversation to start to drive change. So from that perspective, I think there's opportunity to just continue to do things different and be different.
That's really interesting. Anything to add, Diana or Kathy?
So from my perspective, I would say it's one silver lining is that we fast forwarded the misconception that certain roles can't be done at home and people who work from home aren't really working, because
it's a difficult argument to make these days, isn't it?
Exactly. There was always that perception, especially in finance, where working from home is a day off.
Shirking from home. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. It's not, and we've seen people outperform in terms and over deliver in terms of productivity. So that, I'm hoping has now put to bed that misconception. And also, if we look at it from a trading perspective, over the last couple of months we've had traders working from home. The finance industry, for those jobs that were no, you must be in an office, they facilitated it. And I know we're now working towards going back, but it doesn't mean that you can't have that flexibility. So you can open the pool up in terms of new talent that in the past was restricted to certain roles because of this maybe archaic requirement of you must be working in the office these hours. I'm hoping that's one of the linings.
Silver linings there. Yeah. No, excellent. Anything else from anyone else?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say obviously everything that my colleagues have just said is spot on. I think maybe from not so much from like a manager perspective, but from like a much broader, how do we change the world kind of perspective. I think that the point that Karina was making around this situation, demonstrating how coordinated efforts can actually really happen. And so, I mean, with the company, so we're World Economic Forum Tech Pioneers, so I get to like join a lot of, conversations about how do we restart the economy and all of that. And I think that it's been really interesting to see that for some people, obviously it's become very, cynical conversation about, yeah, okay, we'll just try to restart however we can. But actually there's a lot of momentum, I would say, like citizen momentum, like personal momentum in people feeling like, well, we've been doing this has happened. This is like our government deciding to do something like around the world, effectively, that's very coordinated. why can't we do this again for other things, right? For bigger questions that we have as a humanity, right? And so whether it's global, global warming and the issues around that, or even just thinking more ethically about the way that we live, I think that if anything, like the best silver lining is definitely to have realized that these efforts are possible. Like when people get together, this is like, you can literally close down the world, right? And so we need to kind of maybe more structurally now think, how do we keep that, all these lessons we're learning from being here, lockdown, like how do we basically think about reopening the world with that structure in place, right? And so I'm wary, and obviously we're talking about silver linings, so I don't want to like close on a negative note on this, but I am wary that, we should not go back to normal, because we've just gone through something that's pretty extraordinary. And so we need to be thinking as managers about how to structurally do something different that really sets in place something that, transform the ways that we work in the future, right? And so whether it's the mental health bit, all of these things, like it just would be so sad if this was just like a hiatus that everyone forgets and we go back to normal, because this was pretty crazy to be locked in for 2 months. Around the world, globally, everywhere.
It's difficult to top that comment, but it has absolutely been crazy if you think about it, that the entire world has been locked in for 2 months and somehow still continues to function. So thank you all for that. I'd like to make the audience do a little work. So there's 2 tasks here. One is we've got a couple of polling questions, and I'll ask Lucy to launch the first one. So for those of you online, I'd be interested in how your response is to the question, how has the pandemic affected the nature and amount of work your team is now doing? See how that compares to what our panelists had to say. And then, as if that wasn't enough, if you have questions you'd like to put to the panelists, please use the Q&A function and do so now. Do we have an answer, Lucy, for the first one? Let me see what's happening here. Can you share the response with everyone for the first one? Oh, votes are still coming through, I see. Okay. Well, perhaps it would be easier if we answered all of these questions. So the second one, how have team members been affected by the epidemic? Have a go at that. And then finally, what's the biggest challenge you now face from a management perspective? Okay, so Lucy, a guru in the background here, tells me that about 45% of you feel that the epidemic has affected the nature and amount of work your team is now doing only moderately. You're still working as hard, but spending time differently. Another sort of silver lining here, question number 2, how have team members been affected by the epidemic? 42% said most are coping surprisingly well. And for those of you out there who are managers, what's the biggest challenge you now face from a management perspective? This echoes some of the comments our panel has made. 52% find the hardest thing finding the time and energy to provide the support their teams need. So thank you for that. Are you surprised panelists by those answers?
It seems consistent with what we've been talking about, yes.
Yeah. So you're not alone. That's a positive thing. Let's see what questions we've got. This is from Joel Perrin. A question for Diana. Really interesting to think of how managers feel with regard to their own mental health whilst looking out for their staff too. I personally think workplace mental health is more important than ever now. How would you advise managers and other leaders to manage their own mental health whilst also supporting that of their teams?
Yeah, I mean that's a really good question, and I'm sure actually everyone in this panel can give their thoughts on that. But effectively, I do think it's fundamentally, as a manager, you're leading by example, right? And so if you're not taking care of your own mental health, you have to almost see it like as a business transaction. It's just not good home economics for your own business. And so if you think about it from that perspective crudely, it means that everyone kind of knows the things that helps with mental health, right? Whether it's, exercises in mindfulness, whether it's just exercise, just taking a break, time for yourself, just, taking a moment to kind of breathe in fundamentally what's happening around you. There's no way around that, right? As in to feel fine, you need to make the time. You need to block that time. And so I think that, as I was mentioning during this period, from managers, it's been very stressful because you can start feeling. I think there's another question on, like feeling guilty over taking breaks and that kind of stuff, because you feel like your team is working. You feel that if you stop working, then you're going to stop the momentum. All of those things. But fundamentally, you have to just make that time to just feel good. And if you're not good, then you need to pause and you have to force yourself to be self-aware. And if you put it more in the context, I think, of like a business transaction, because managers are we're thinking about being efficient, that's why we're managers, then there is a reality that if you're not doing well, and you don't make that time to pause and take in things, you're not going to be doing a very good job. That's going to translate to your team. And you have to lead by example. It's your responsibility to be captain of your ship. So, I'm not sure if I always do a good job from the pausing perspective, but I do definitely try to do that, because I know that it has an impact on myself. It has an impact on the way I can manage the team, and on just, being serene for my own team, right? Because it makes you more impatient. It makes you less self-aware if you don't make that break for yourself, basically.
Thank you for that. Here's a question from someone who hasn't written a name on it. I often feel guilty about taking a break when working from home. However, by the end of the day, I'm exhausted. I really like the idea of scheduled breaks. How would you recommend scheduling this, and what has worked for you? So someone who's maybe organized scheduled breaks for their team, how was that?
Sure. Yeah, so we were very open, because we got to that stage where everyone felt guilty about leaving the others to face all the work, but at the end of the day, you're just not functioning, and it's not fair for the people you live with and yourself. So we were very open. I just said to the team, between each of you, just decide if you want to take lunchtime out. So let's say someone wants to take 12 to 1 out, where they're not going to be in front of a computer and they're going to have lunch with their partner and their children. Or someone will say, I've got a bike at home, I want to do some exercise, so I'm going to take the afternoon, 4 to 5. They still get a lunch break, so I'm not that cruel, but they are going to be able to say, I'm not going to be looking at my emails. So so you really have to work with your colleagues and see what works for them and their circumstance. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, your manager will appreciate it if you are very transparent as to when you're online and when you're not online, and what the reasons you are and where you are, because they know you're at home, you're not going anywhere else.
Yeah. A question from Ashley Seymour. We've spoken a lot about how hard our teams are working. What are some of your best ideas, most inventive ideas for recognizing this hard work?
Yeah, so we do, the last thing we do every Friday now before team beers, which seems to be obligatory in most businesses, is we do a celebration of that week's achievements. So again, because we're quite new in our corporate development, there's lots of things changing every week. So we take half an hour to an hour every week just to celebrate the achievements of individuals and teams publicly. Although applause on Zoom is strange, but we make it work. And then we've upped so we always have had schemes to recognise outstanding performance. Whether, I mean, obviously there's bonus and pay rises and all of that stuff, but we have a more regular sort of spotlight award, and that's been the frequency of that has been increased during lockdown. So we have more formal channels to give little presents to people to say thank you very much. We're also really good. So when we had our first transaction, everyone got sent brownies to their home, and it takes very little to make somebody feel a bit special in lockdown, and a £5 present through the post is there's a world of good for somebody feeling a bit isolated.
Excellent thought. I think brownies are something that almost anyone could rally around. So well done. A final question here before we begin the last bit of our event, which will be a virtual networking event for those of you who can stay for another half hour. This is from Kevin, who wants to know how are you monitoring productivity, and how do you manage team members who are not able or willing to pull their weight?
So in terms of productivity, we are client facing. So in terms of clients, I mean internal clients. So we've got our sales and trading teams. We also have external clients who call us direct, and we've had a lot more interaction with our clients. And one of the benefits of this experience has been you are now much more on a personal basis with your clients, because you're in their home and they're in yours. So that's also a good thing. So we would know straight away if the productivity declined, because things wouldn't get answered on a timely basis. And we are in risk management, so you have a certain type of person within risk. They very rarely do they sort of not deliver, and they're not attention to detail. I think that's the only way you can, where people aren't pulling their weight, because you need to understand, is there a family circumstance they haven't told you about? So for example, if they are looking after people, children are older, or just, they're not feeling it. And that's really your job as a manager, to know your people. And now you can have these one-to-ones far more frequently. You can tell whether it's just a blip or it's actually something more fundamental that you need to give them a hand with. And I think that's the onus on the manager, to know their people and help them.
I think that's an excellent way to end this discussion. Thank you very much for that, Sadia. As I mentioned earlier, for those of you who are able to make it, our panelists have offered to stay, and I hope many of you will be able to do so, to join one of several virtual chat rooms. And I'll give you an opportunity to meet some of the people who are online, and perhaps to exchange war stories. So Lucy, can you do the necessary? I see Lucy has, if you look in the chat, you'll see there's a link. If you just click on the link, that should put you into a chat room. Perfect. And I hope, Lucy, if you just bring us back to the larger group after this is over, that would be great. So I can wish everyone, thank everyone for their comments, and wish them success, continued success. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.